My name is Augustina Ragwitz. Hi, everybody. I'm here to talk about the social economy of open source. So I work for IBM, and we have a group called Cognitive Open Tech. I think CODE is what we're calling ourselves now. I'm still confused. But basically, we focus on open source, data science, and artificial intelligence communities. My role, I recently figured out what my job title is, so I'm very happy about that. Because I work in this really strange place where I've been a contributor to open source for a number of years. But in the past few years, I did my undergrad in anthropology, and that's my educational background before shifting into doing software because it just paid really well, and I also enjoyed it. Have enjoyed it. As I became more interested in studying contributors and actually contributing, so to speak, or anyways, so my job essentially is a computational anthropologist. I discovered this title from reading some papers, but basically what I do is I actually study open source communities, and I'm particularly interested in the issue of social capital and the concept of social currency. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the thing so why should you think about open source? And so I want to be clear that contributing to open source and the nature of open source communities is changing organizations. So that's kind of the area that I study, is organizational anthropology. Organizations evolve and they change. It's not like you have some static notion of how things are and then it's like that forever. And open source is very rapidly evolving, especially as more large corporations like IBM, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, a lot of the big ones are now not only engaging in open source, but they're actually paying people to contribute upstream because they are seeing some value. And so one of my challenges has been, how do we quantify the value of those contributions when it's not something that's very easily quantifiable? And so everybody's, so that's a big thing, is people are thinking about, like, how do we, what does it mean for us, like, as an organization? On an individual level, the advantage for us is that now, because companies are interested in this experience, they are working more in the open, in these open source communities and collaborating with each other. The company is no longer the gatekeeper to your access to technology or your ability to learn and your ability to gain experience and to your work, period. So when you do work in an open source community, it's available, it's public. If you decide to leave your employer for whatever reason and you look for another employer, your work you don't lose access to your work. You don't lose access to the projects. You can continue working on the work, doing what you do, whether you're doing it officially for the company or not. So it gives you more control over what you do. And so that's where I allude to it as the means of production, because it gives us, more ownership and more ability and more access to what we're doing. And I think it allows us to be more engaged personally as well. So that's the point. If you leave your employer, you're still part of this community, because this community is technically, it's external to your employer, but there is a little bit of overlap. And when we think about social currency, what we're talking about really is relationships. And so the relationships that you have with other people in the community are ultimately the currency of open source. And some could argue this is true in a variety of settings if you're used to dealing with clients, or even within your company. We might say relationships are kind of the currency of humanity, but for this purpose, we'll say relationships are the currency of open source. So what exactly is social capital? So when we think of traditional capital, we think of a one-for-one exchange of goods and services. Traditional capital is something that's tangible, immediate, quantifiable. So even if you don't immediately get a repayment for whatever it is, there's some notion of what it was worth. There's some kind of a promissory note, or there's something that indicates that there was a value and some kind of an agreed upon exchange. And we think of it as more of a direct accumulation. Social capital gets a little squishier. So social capital is also termed symbolic capital. In anthropology, we might refer to it as amity or kinship amity, so relationship between kinship structures and how one way of looking at power hierarchies across cultures. We think of it as it's a one-way transfer ideally without the intent of repayment. essentially, thinking of it as sort of the driving force of human relationships, and some theories suggest that our relationships are created through this sense of obligation. So somebody does something for you, and so you have, on some level, a feeling of obligation to that person. Another key thing about social capital versus, I think, traditional capital, it's a little fuzzier, but social capital is not independent of the giver. And so what that means is that when somebody does something for you, that person's that personality, that individual is deeply rooted in that transaction, so to speak. So they're not actually separate. And so then your accumulations sort of center around individual people. It's not just, you can't really separate what they've done for you with who did it for you. And these are things that happen over time. And so this is where it gets really hard to study, is because it can take years to really see patterns in this sort of thing. Anybody who's had friends, or worked at a company or had any kind of social relationship with anybody knows that it can take time to really build deep relationships with people. And that's because social capital, it's not immediate. It takes time. And it can also make it very challenging to study. So more concretely, what does social capital look like? Well, internally at IBM, there's this really great group called the Institute for Business Value. And internally at IBM, they launched a global eminence activation and advocacy program where they highlighted some really wonderful things. And so I've been working with them in terms of the open source eminence, because they're just a lot better at kind of, I don't want to say the marketing, because marketing makes it sound insincere, but I'm more of a technical person, and so I tend to be very dry and to the point. So this is for people internal. I don't think that, I'm not sure if this is accessible for for external IBMers. I can never tell. But the idea here, so at IBM we use a term called eminence, and so that's where the term eminence comes from. But you can also think of it as prestige, influence. I think intuitively we sort of understand what eminence means. It means having some kind of prominence and trust and reputation in a community. And so the framework essentially is that you need to be essential through what you offer to the world. So it's not about what you push out into the world, but it's what the world perceives the value of what you have to offer is. And eminence is something ultimately that's earned externally. So the community, external people essentially decide, not necessarily consciously, that this or that or the other person is eminent. It's not something that you can set as a goal, like I'm going to be the most eminent person in this community and have really any control over whether or not it happens. So what they phrase it as with the IBV is we think in terms of eminence activation. And so the idea is that only like 1% of the whole population is really going to achieve this, this amazing eminent prestige. But all of us I think that we increase our chances by engaging in certain behaviors and holding certain values in order to guide our engagement and our involvement. And even if you're not number one eminent, like it's still very valuable. You're still doing a lot of good for the community. So it's not really a bad thing. Like there are still benefits to yourself and to your own career and just to your own well-being. And so this is a little more example. Again, this is from the Institute for Business Value from IBM. But they've identified some eminence potential dimensions and characteristics. And so the thing I thought was really nice about this is that they split it into 3 pillars. So 3 ways of sort of thinking about this. You have your body of work. And so that's the actual push, right? So that's, those are things like the blog entries that you write, the papers that you write, the code that you commit, the actual tangible things that you're putting out. Credibility is a little more fuzzy, but it's things like, do you have a degree? Do you have some kind of certification? But on the other side, it's how consistently do you engage in terms of your body of work? So are you, committing on this project, pretty regularly, or do you just kind of come in and do stuff, when you have something, that you want to work on? It's just, it's all kind of fluid. But essentially, credibility is the domain expertise and how people see you as an expert, or what they see in terms of how they sort of gauge your expertise. And visibility is the pull. So visibility is those external relationships, your reputation. When we think in terms of marketing, those will be like your engagement things. And there's a lot of different ways that people have proposed for measuring that. So it's not just I posted, 20 tweets. It's how many people, and not just how many people viewed your tweets, but how many people commented, how many people, how many actual relationships did you develop through using the social media. So visibility, it's really thinking more in terms of your connections and how you're connecting. And so the IBB also proposes these different profiles, which I thought were kind of neat. Ultimately, I think that for the open source version of this, I decided not to do profiles and to just sort of stick with something a little more generic because there's so much variability in how you can be involved in open source. And it's sort of the same here, but it's just to kind of provide some guidance and ways that you can kind of think about your goal setting. So, and so here the idea is, are you focusing more on thought leadership and points of view? Are you really adding? So sort of the next level up for that is that you're more of an advocate and that you're really, adding a particular unique point of view. And then, or are you like a deeply technical person? And so you're acknowledged for that aspect. And so those are just some different ways to think about how to develop your relationships in open source communities. So more specifically, how do I accumulate social capital? So again, I want to bring it back because I know this can be a little, fuzzy and weird for folks that may not be as familiar with social science and thinking about things this way. So has anyone ever done you a favor? And so what I want you to think about is, so have you ever had a relative, for example, do something for you, but then you knew oh, they really want me to watch their kids next weekend. Like the only reason they're doing this is because they want something from me. Versus, wow, this person is doing this for me. Like, I think there's this, I was hearing something on a podcast of people that donate organs to strangers, like just purely like they have no intentions whatsoever. And that's kind of an interesting how people respond to that as well as kind of people are like, well, that's really weird. Why would you do that? Anyway, so we can go down a whole rabbit hole into this, but essentially we're looking at the middle of the bell curve. Generally, if somebody expects something from you and they're doing you a favor, I mean, it's not entirely positive social capital, right? Like, and you may decide whether or not to allow them to do you the favor. It's going to affect how you value the favor that they've done for you. It'll have less value for you, and it'll probably make you not feel quite so good, unless it's something you were going to do anyways, and then you feel like you got something extra out of it. But again, this gets complicated. But the nutshell is, generally, people know, like if you're doing something because you expect something in return, people can generally smell it. And so it tends to have less value. Let me go back. So another more tangible example, do you donate to charity or volunteer? And so this is where we're going to start thinking about open source communities. In the groups that you donate or volunteer to, do you have a sense of like, who are the most respected members of these groups? And ask yourself, how do you know who these people are? And I would say in some cases, it's because they're officially, I volunteer with the Portland Opera and Opera Theater Oregon. And in both cases, the prominent people have titles or they're associated with the organization as the person who runs the board. And so there's some sense of eminence in that regard because it's conferred through the sponsoring organization, which also happens in open source. For instance, Google and TensorFlow, people from Google will naturally be more prominent or eminent because Google is sponsoring the project. That said, in terms of the rest of us, or in terms of organizations that aren't necessarily run that way, oftentimes it's the people that have been engaged. Maybe they've been engaged the longest, or there's a sense of that they do the most. It's, and there isn't like a single right answer for this. It's just kind of something to think about. How do you know, who has the most social capital, so to speak, in the group? And the other things to think about is, why do you do it? If you volunteer with the group, you donate to a charity, like I donate to public radio, I donate to a lot of arts organizations. Why do I do that? Like, I don't get anything out of it, right? Like, I'm not buying anything. I don't immediately get something. I would argue on one level, it makes me feel good. I get endorphins, I guess. You know, but the reasons why we do it are varied. And so it's just something to think about. Again, there is no single right answer. There isn't even, I don't really think that there's wrong answers, so to speak. It's just stuff to think about in terms of your own, when you think about building your own reputation in open source communities. Why do you volunteer? You know, why do you donate to charity? These are some of the same things that should be driving your engagement with open source. And so these are my fun rules for Eminence. The first one is don't talk about eminence or prestige or influence or whatever you want to call it. Because if that is your goal, like I said, you're coming in, you're doing things for the community, and it's kind of obvious that, you know, you have this intention. And so people are naturally not going to trust you. And it may shade your interactions and make you seem less sincere, which leads to number two, keep it real. So keeping it real is about being authentic. Like, you know, a lot of people talk about this development of a personal brand. I understand what they mean, but I think it sounds a little insincere. I don't want to say insincere, but like created or, you know, cooked up, you know. And so the idea is that if you create a quote personal brand, like it needs to be authentically you. And so that's really what it's about. And that, again, that'll lead into making it personal. Oftentimes, I think in traditional notions, and I certainly when I was, as I've been going through my career, a lot of career advice is about compartmentalization. You know, keep your personal life and your work life separate. Don't share personal details at work. You know, just keep it a really dry, boring, you know, environment so everybody can get along. And I think like new generations of people, so I'm Gen X and I think millennials, maybe we share some of these values. That I think that's really hard to do. I don't think that you can just not be yourself, or I think that like makes for really broken people. So open source, it's really hard, especially because you have these long-term relationships and they extend beyond your employer. So you're kind of in this weird middle ground. You end up knowing a lot of personal stuff about people. You experience things with people, people go through personal changes and you're aware of it. And I would argue even in work, if you're working at the same company for a long time, you know, you end up having these relationships with people that extend beyond the boundary of work, and that's perfectly appropriate. And I want to add to that, that on a personal level, if you're not engaged in what you're doing in a way that relates to your life overall, I would argue it's almost less fulfilling. And so if you want to develop a true, authentic way of engaging with the community, then you really need to tap into something that really matters to you and make yourself a little bit vulnerable. And so this is really about owning it. That's what number 4. It means to take responsibility for things and to really say, you know what, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to put myself out there. I'm going to take a risk. You know, I care about this and I'm going to tell everybody I care about it. And I care about it so much that I'm willing to put it into action. And finally, do it for the love. So this relates kind of back to number 1. Don't do it for the eminence. Do it for the love. Do it because it's something that you care about personally, and that it's something that really matters to you. So a little more focused. So it's just kind of a high level way of thinking about eminence. But the first one is building a narrative. And in anthropology, we use ethnography. We have different methods and techniques. There's a really great book I've been reading called Ethnographic Thinking, which I highly recommend. I should probably link it in the slides. I'll put something in the chat when I get a chance. But this is a really wonderful book that kind of gets you thinking about qualitative research as kind of an opposed to the more hypothesis-driven research, and how to counter. Anyways, I'm rambling. But so building a narrative, what you're trying to do is you don't want to, at this point, you're not really passing judgment. You're really just observing. But you want to be able to answer these questions. You want to understand, what is the community about? Now, I'm going to assume that you've already identified some open source communities that you're interested in engaging in. There are other talks and other resources that talk about how to find a community. I would argue it almost happens by accident sometimes. Like as soon as you kind of put your thoughts out into the universe, well, I really want to get involved in open source, suddenly you start seeing it everywhere, and you're going to jump around probably until you find the right fit, or you might find the right fit right away. But the first things that you want to ask is you want to come in, you want to be an active listener, or in ethnography, what we like to say, a layered listener, but it's a little more involved. And so you're really just trying to get a feel for the lay of the land, who's who, and whether or not this is the right place for you. And you're trying to see where possibilities of, where you can potentially fit in. But some key things to think about are, how do people typically communicate? Do they use mailing lists? That's a bit more old-fashioned. People don't always do that, but some groups do very heavily, like an OpenStack. Mailing lists and IRC are some of the key channels, IRC being Internet Relay Chat, which most folks use Slack nowadays. Internet Relay Chat is sort of like the open source Wild West version of that that's been around for a bazillion years. So it's another flavor. I don't think it has GIFs and emojis, so maybe that's why people like Slack better. I don't know. Anyways, but what books are people reading? What podcasts, what blogs, what other media are people consuming? That gives you a sense of what's shaping thoughts and opinions, and it allows you to be able to participate in conversations through the media channels that the community uses to communicate. Where are major conferences and how do people find out about them? I also want to add to this, meetup.com is a really great resource for local user groups and meetups for finding those. It's really important to interact with people in person, not just online, because those high bandwidth connections that you make with people are going to be a lot stronger. It makes you a real person. And so if you're engaging in a local group or a local conference or a local meetup, local user group, and then you go to a major conference, you already know people, hopefully. And there's just, it's like, oh, well, I know this person, I know that person. You're kind of going in with a physical connection before when you go into the larger group. So it's a good way to go. Other things to ask, how is the community organized? For instance, is there some kind of a board? Is it just kind of, are there sponsoring companies? Is there some kind of a foundation? You don't necessarily have to think in terms of like, I want to be on the foundation, or I want to be, whatever, but being aware of like where decisions are made, and if you have ideas, like where you're going to need to present them is a good way to go. And who are the most eminent people? Why are they so well respected? And I think that's really key. Sometimes you can have people that appear to be eminent that are actually not that well respected. They're sort of like old guard, curmudgeonly people that are really grumpy. And in that case, there's some interesting dynamics around that, but you can really get a sense of like, within the community. You'll also find people that may not be as active, that are not as vocal, but they do a lot of work behind the scenes. Maybe there are people that aren't as technical and contributing code, but they're really heavily involved in the foundation or other policy related decisions. So just being aware of all the different layers of who's doing what in a community can be really helpful. So now this is where you make it about you. You need to figure out what your sweet spot is. What do you care about? What's your personal relationship? Or where can you have the things that you're personally passionate about overlap with the community? And what do you have to offer? What does the community care about? What do you care about? Where's the overlap? And then if you're working for an employer who's paying you to work in the open source, or encouraging you, or you want to make it part of your day job, then you have to think about that as well and find that overlap. In my case, I had a few different areas. Like I'm an amateur musician, so I study classical piano and classical voice. I have some ideas, but I haven't quite figured out how to make that overlap with the art community just yet. Or maybe more AI. But two of the other things is, with my software engineering background and data science, oftentimes people value that perspective. But the thing that I've really enjoyed the most, and I think I've been getting the most pull from, is the fact that I come from the social science background, and that I feel like I've always walked in between social science and computer science. And I see myself doing the same thing in data science. So being an advocate for the social sciences, the humanities, for the qualitative, mixed methods, quantitative and qualitative. So that's what I see myself evolving into, at least in the art community. And that's what I enjoy. So it can take time, and you have to experiment. But I would say do something that, find that sweet spot, find the thing that you're really passionate about that meets all of these requirements. And again, think about possibilities and be open to things evolving. So how do you make friends? And this is kind of related to number one, because you've already figured out where people are talking. But what are events that you can attend? Who are some people that you really want to interact with on Twitter, especially people that share, like if you've identified your sweet spot, your thing that you're really passionate about, this is something you're immediately going to have an interaction with other folks around. So, or that you'll immediately have a connection, and it'll be really easy for you to have conversations and connect in ways that are sincere, and you'll actually make like real friends. Also think about what do you want to learn and how do you want to grow. And instead of thinking, the other thing that's kind of weird is that, like, if somebody has approached me and said, wow, you can really help me, it's kind of turned me off. You know, it's like, oh, why should I? Or, wow, okay. But really think about what you can do for them. What are they working on? What do they care about? How can you do them some favors? Do they have something they're working on that you can, you know, you want to write some unit tests? This is often in communities where code is the primary thing. I've offered to do the unit tests for a particular thing, and then that somebody's working on, and so it allows me to develop kind of an apprenticeship relationship with the with the person who's working on the main feature and to learn the system. So again, and always don't just think about what you want, but think about what, you know, what they might want or what could be helpful for them, and try to balance that. Oh, I forgot to change the title on this one. So it's this is how can I help the community, is what this should say, that first bullet point there. But always think, you know, in a bigger picture, or, you know, try to think a little bigger picture, like how do my actions show my commitment to the community? Are there special interest groups or committees that I could be a member of? Here you're really trying to show that you authentically, truly care about the community, in ways that, you know, that will help others and will draw others to you. In terms of credibility, thinking about what classes you can take or certificates or degrees that increase, you know, your technical knowledge or other knowledge areas. So just a variety of things to think about. And so I'm just adding this as like a fun thing. But again, check your motivation. Not that there's anything wrong with Miss Piggy, but, you know, and Kermit can kind of be a pushover sometimes. So you definitely want to rock the balance. But it's really about, when it comes to open source engagement in communities, you really want to think about how you can help the community and to further the collective good. And then, so another thing is you want to think about how to step up your engagement. So what community issues so what issues are important to the community, and which ones are you really strongly tied to? For instance, in our community, I learned about our ladies, and being that I myself am an underrepresented minority in tech and data science, I felt, hey, this is something I can get on board. And so I'm been really happy to find that. So that's awesome. Is there a local user group that you can organize? Well, there wasn't in Our Ladies Portland PDX, so I said, okay, well then I'm going to organize it. And so that's great, because then people in the community are really grateful to you, because now you're showing your commitment and you're giving something back to the community by having another user group and getting more people involved in the community. Are there committees that you could chair? If not a committee, some kind of initiative or a project that you could organize. And so this is what I talk about owning it earlier. This is where you're really putting yourself out there and showing your commitment, and that you're not just, you know, a flyby, you know, oh, I'm just using the thing and I'm just here on the weekends, but like I'm really committed to this community. And so in terms of tracking your progress, one of the things I recommend is to do a periodic progress report. And this is the thing. So originally I had talked about, oh, you can do this in R and you can do all these great things. The thing about that, so R is great because you can do narratives with your code embedded in it. But I've been finding that for my own tracking, I've actually been doing, so I'm sharing a screen. This is just we use box notes at IBM. I call this the personal beans report because I like to make jokes about bean counting. But these are examples of goals that I'll set for myself each month. Like these are my advocacy efforts. This is what I'm going to do this month. And these are all tied to larger values. And so right now, this is actually just a checklist in a notebook, but you could potentially use R for something like that and show additional things that I'll talk about. Yes, and we have the IBM data science community. So there's a lot of great things. I guess I'm still kind of working out. So what we're working on for in my group, or for the organization, is this idea of this open source eminence activation. And I've got a link for this at the end of my slides. But this goes over a lot of the things that I'm talking about and goes into more detail about building a narrative and setting goals and more specific ideas in how to measure your progress. I think it'd be really cool for folks if you did figure out something that worked for you in R, especially to share it. And that's something I'm trying to work on myself. Right now, everything's very qualitative, which is great. But sometimes it's nice to have numbers and to get that balance. So segue into the quantitative aspects of social capital. How do you measure it? And this is actually a big research topic for me. So, so I'm working on it as my answer. But the first thing that you want to do is set up, I think you should establish, write a personal mission statement. And so there's some really great resources in this document here that I've linked. This is so RPubs is a really cool, by the way, I should segue and mention RPubs. This is from RStudio, and you can publish from within R. Any of your R markdown, you can publish it as HTML and then host it for free here. I use it all the time. I think I have like 50 different accounts. I don't know if that's a service use violation or not, but anyways. And so I have some initial starts at like some of these worksheets around things, as well as like some links. But there's one up here about a personal mission statement, along with some things that I found pretty useful in developing my own. And I kind of riffed off of the Franklin Covey's mission statement builder. These are just some ideas of things. And so again, this is important because you're trying to identify, what do I care about? What do I bring to the community? A community engagement statement of purpose is important because these are things that are going to be refined. You're going to rewrite them. These things evolve. It's not like you just write it once and then you forget about it the rest of your life. And so the community engagement statement of purpose is really about why, what you bring to the community. Again, for lack of a better term, that personal brand. I hate that, it's so artificial, but it's really about like where your community, where the community, your employer's needs, if they're a factor in this, and your personal needs overlap. And so let's see. And so then the next thing that you want to do is actually set some high level milestones. And that's what I was showing in the thing I was sharing, is these are just like some different milestones that I've done. I'm looking for, so here's an example, this Eminence activation plan. So the idea here is that you set some kind of, and you kind of start small. I would recommend just setting a few small ones because I know I get overwhelmed and distracted really easily. But set a couple shorter term ones that are like 6 months out, and like a long term one that's maybe like a year or 2 years. And so these are examples of different things that would define what success looks like, what are the actions needed to achieve the milestone, and what help. I like to call it roadside assistance because I like funny things. But so the idea is like, what does success look like? What things can you do to get there, and what help do you need? And I would emphasize, when you're setting these kinds of goals, to be careful about setting goals of things that have to be community conferred. So for instance, many open source communities, you have this concept of a core committer status. That's something that sometimes can be highly political, and it's dependent on a lot of external factors, your access to work on certain projects, having just the right opportunities. And so one goal that I had set for myself on a project in the past or in a community in the past, was to say, I want to be core worthy. So I want to know that if that I could be considered to be a core committer, even though I'm not actually, and even though there may be political things. It helped me to focus on what are the qualities of, in my head, what a core committer are compared to, what I see in the community, and just getting a sense of where core committer would be somebody who has eminence and is highly engaged with the community. So the goal, again, isn't to be eminent per se, but it's to take ownership, for things that I care about, to show my commitment to the community, and the core committer status is recognition from the community that I've done that. So core worthy means I feel like I've pushed enough things out there, and then it's thinking about the pull and how I get folks to trust me. So measuring your progress. So for quantitative analysis of this kind of stuff, of squishy human things, the one thing you have to remember is there's no one size fits all. Every community is different and every person is different. The type of role that you may be seeking or that you may be seeing yourself as contributing to a community, it may not exist. And so you may have to come up with something. So you need to come up with some kind of a baseline. So for example, in the art community, we have this fantastic person named Mara Avery, who's very eminent on Twitter. That sentence doesn't really make any sense, but I don't know. I think you will understand what I mean. She has this amazing reputation. She's asked to keynote conferences. She's got a really great personality, and she's a really nice person too. And her thing is that she engages primarily on Twitter, and so her baseline, so if you're looking at somebody like Mara and you're like, wow, I really like what Mara does. She reads these articles and she provides all this value to the community as sort of like a news feed, but it's a very personal news feed. It's stuff she likes. And so she shares it. And it just so happens a lot of people find it really useful, including myself. And so what kind of a baseline would that be? Like, what are her engagements? And the nice thing about Twitter is everything's public. So it's pretty easy to see, who's engaging, how many comments she's getting, how many followers she has. Those are some things that you can use. But my advice would be look for people that are kind of similar to what you are aspiring to be, and then set some tangible goals around that, just to get a feel for how you're doing. And so then you use the numbers to guide and test your strategy, rather than saying, well, I don't have 1,000 followers, I better go buy some bots, so that I can have 1,000 followers. Instead, you think about, well, maybe 1,000 was unrealistic. What is a realistic, time thing for me? But, I should be getting like 10 new followers a month, and I'm not really getting that. So is there something I can do better? Is there a different time I should be posting my tweets? Should I be associating my tweets with different events? What are some other strategies I can use to have this medium be more effective and really make it more about like the communication and again, why are you doing this? Well, you want to be helpful. You want people you believe your messages provide value to people, and so you want to make sure that people are getting value from it. And, finally tell a story. So everything, the numbers, and then this is where the qualitative comes in. You want to tell some kind of a story about your personal engagement, not just I posted 10 tweets and they had X many comments and whatever, but, this month we had these events going on. I shared some details about some of the events, and then you can highlight a couple stories about that, or yeah. So then to further clarify what I mean about the quantitative and the qualitative, an example of push would be, so I wrote 10 blog posts. My 10 blog posts received a distribution of, I don't know, like 2, 3, 4, 5 comments. And then I had 4 people retweet commits. So I pushed this many commits to this project or pull requests, as they're called on GitHub. And I had so many people do code reviews. Tweets, how many people retweeted, how many people commented. So those are things that you would look at in terms of quantitative for measuring the pull, to see how people are engaging with what you're pushing, the content, your body of work that you're pushing out into the world. Qualitatively, you don't necessarily need to report on every single data point, but it's kind of nice, like if you show some kind of a plot to say, oh, this is how somebody benefited. So I had this many people comment and share my blog posts, and I had a really great conversation with Renee, who said that my blog post about functions in R was really helpful, and that it provided some insights she hadn't known, and she was able to apply it to her own project. And and then another person I spoke to, Gabriella, is now going to do a meetup talk, about this very topic because she was so inspired by my blog post. I don't know. This is like an example of things that, of stories that you can tell that tell you a little bit more about the data points that you're showing on the plot. And again, same with commits and tweets. Commits, how did the project benefit? Tweets, how did your interaction actually impact the community? So was there something going on a larger scale? Did you share about a particular event happening that you cared about? Was there something particularly effective about sharing, like, oh, I didn't know about this event and I heard about it through Twitter, and I talked to several other people at the event that wouldn't have heard about this event if they hadn't have seen, the stream of tweets around it. So I'm really glad that we're using this as a tool. So again, these stories are pretty critical. So to kind of think about it high level, when you're thinking about ways to measure your social pull, you want to think in terms of the response. So, and this can be a little more quantitative, but like, how many people are looking, and not just like clicking, not just likes, not just starring your repo or whatever, or thumbs upping things, but like really how many people are commenting, like what are some heavier weight engagements? Relationships, who are you connecting with? Are there people that, or how are the relationships changing? Did you have a did you meet somebody last month that was your first interaction, and then this month you've discovered you have a lot of things in common? Did you meet somebody in person at a conference and now you're going to write a paper together? And reflections are things like, how effective is my strategy? Am I really being my authentic self? Is this working for me? Am I happy? Am I comfortable with this? And then more quantitatively, when's the best time to post, a tweet, or when, what types of, when I have certain things in my commits, I seem to get better code reviews, or when I structure things this way, I'm getting better quality code reviews and interactions. So just reflections on how you can meet your mission better. Right, and then I go through each of these. So I'll just kind of flip through these kind of quick because I just talked about them. But yeah, some traditional marketing things look at how long did it take you to respond. And one thing to remember is that you don't need to respond to things right away. It really depends on what it is. But it can be kind of interesting to see, at least for effectiveness of when people are actually seeing your content, because views, again, it only gives you so much. But if you can look at what time and how long it takes somebody to respond to your content, and you can come up with some reasons as to why one time would be faster than others, then that can be insightful for when you can be more effective, for example, in sharing your content. And then sentiment analysis is something that comes up. Sentiment analysis isn't quite as evolved as I think marketing folks would like it to be. But it's something that's interesting and it's something to play with. But you can kind of, even if you do it qualitatively through like a manual sample, to get a sense of like, are people generally positive? Are people just retweeting and not saying anything? What do people think about the stuff I'm putting out there? And relationships, looking at connections is also really interesting. So, and this is something I've started playing with the iGraph library for looking at, different ways that you can weight connections. And one thing that I propose here in the Eminence write-up that I did is, I think I proposed this. I think I want to propose it if it's not there, is some recommendations for ways to sort of weight your relationships. And this is going to be something very individual. But thinking about, what's the weight of your connection to this person? So somebody that's following you on Twitter that you sometimes comment on each other's stuff, but you've never actually met in person and you don't even know what they look like, or they're like a picture of a dog, as far as you know, that's probably not going to be as heavy of a connection as somebody that you met, sat next to at lunch at a conference, you had something in common, and now you follow each other on Twitter and you see each other regularly at meetups or conferences or something like that, then that's going to be like a 10, So I would recommend thinking about ways to translate sort of your qualitative views of relationships with people to some kind of a quantitative scale that's flexible, just to kind of as a tool. And then again, reflections, just what activities seem to be the most effective for your mission. Again, not to achieve eminence, but to whatever your personal mission that you identify as, the way that you want to make the community better. So is this a prescription for eminence? If you do all these things, is it a guarantee? Well, first off, you shouldn't really be asking yourself that. I mean, sometimes you can't help it, but you do, one wonders, but really that shouldn't be your driving force. Focus on the goals, like what it is that you want to contribute to the community and the mission that you've identified, how you can really push the community forward. And so this is why we call it eminence potential, eminence activation, these kinds of things. It's not a guarantee, but at least you're in the right space. Ultimately, that kind of a thing is a designation from other people and from the community. And so one thing that I do want to talk about before I wrap up and take questions is this idea of negative social capital. So sometimes, because people are people, we might say and do things, and this has happened to me too, as you get involved, especially in open source communities and other communities, you might meet people that have different views than you, that just have a completely different context. Maybe their gender identity is something you haven't really been exposed to before, or it can be, something really deeply personal. It could be mental health related. It could just be something that you just don't really have a good framework. And so sometimes in the process, we might say or do things, especially in ways that are digital and publicly archived, that could come back to haunt us. And so I just want to talk briefly about that, like based, just some of my own experiences, like how to handle those situations. So if you do take a misstep and really your intentions are sincere, like you just were like, I honestly didn't know. Some things that you really don't want to do is just to then, so say it was on Twitter, you said something, you used a word that you didn't realize had a connotation or whatever, and somebody's like, oh my God, you terrible person, you're such a whatever is. Don't just publicly apologize and not talk to anybody. Oh, I am sorry, I didn't know, and make a big deal about it, because that's really going into the second thing, which is making it about you. So this shouldn't be you're not trying to seek attention here. You're really trying to admit, to humble yourself and to be like, oh, I legitimately made a mistake. I really want to do what's right. So don't turn it into a, oh, I'm the victim here. You guys are being so mean to me. I didn't mean it that way. Gosh. But recognize, take responsibility, whatever your intentions were, take responsibility that whatever you said or did had an impact on somebody else. And the last thing is, don't pretend that it didn't happen. So don't just publicly apologize and then forget about it, because people don't forget those things. That's a relationship that you have to, I don't want to say repair, but it is something now with the community, you have to recognize, you've got to move forward. And to kind of put another slant on it is, don't stay involved with the community if things do get unhealthy. So I've actually left communities for this. Sometimes you do step on a raw nerve, and then people want a punching bag, and so you kind of become that. And even if you might just realize that ideologically it's just not a good fit. And and to that I would just say, you kind of need to bow out gracefully. It's not you, it's me. But there are ways to do that, and then don't go around talking smack about the community. That's also kind of negative. But just acknowledge sometimes it's just you're just not aligned, and that's okay. And so what you really don't want to do is dig yourself into a hole, by just really saying something really negative and then just deleting your comments. And then again, just doing a complete public apology that doesn't really address any of the issues and is just really about, oh, but I'm the victim. I think the phrase is I'm sorry that, you're upset, but, I'm, what about me, kind of thing. So just be aware of that. So to be ending on a more positive note, tips for rebuilding. You always want to have a high bandwidth conversation. You really want to make sure that if there's one, even if you've offended a group of people or a group of people are upset by something that you've said or done, you want to make sure that you're at least talking to, maybe the organizer of the group, if you're not sure about individuals. But make sure that if you can't see them face to face, then get on a Google Hangouts. Get on a video chat if you can, or at least have a phone call. Do not talk over email. Do not talk over chat. I highly recommend that you actually talk, because you can work out a lot of things that way. It also shows that you're brave, that you're courageous, and that you're sincere. And if they don't want to talk to you, then that may be an opportunity to just move on and maybe find another community. The other things to think about is, how can you work together? So rebuilding does take time, and so it will take time. But in terms of working together, maybe there's some issue around, maybe you showed some ignorance in a way, and you're I really want to learn more about this, and I know other people are probably just as confused as I am. How can we work together to, is there an initiative that we can push? Is there a blog entry we can write together? Is there something, can we put on an event? Can we host a meetup? Is there something that we can do together to help educate and help other people to learn a better perspective about this issue? And so remember, don't think of it as don't feel ashamed, because this has happened to me before too, where I've misstepped and I've been really upset about hurting somebody's feelings when that wasn't my intention. You know, and people might want to try to make you feel ashamed, or you might feel ashamed. Don't do that. Like, this isn't necessarily a mistake that needs to be fixed. This is an opportunity for growth, and it's an opportunity to build an even deeper relationship with your community and to expand your own potential to be an eminent and key person in the community. So authentic passion is infectious. Find your thing that drives you. And this is the link to, and I'll go ahead and, I can't copy it, but it's in the slides. But this is like the write-up with some of the worksheets and some of the ideas. Yeah, please feel free to reach out if you have questions or, you know, anything. I'm trying to see, I was trying to open an R notebook I'd been working on earlier, but somehow having this stuff running on my computer kind of tanks everything. I'll check back, but I can show, like, I can go into more detail about like some of the things that I'm reporting on. And again, right now, I'm not looking so much as at the individual metrics. You know, it's right now, everything is very qualitative because I'm still working out in my head what I think is important. But, you know, so these are just examples of, okay, I'll say I'll write a blog entry. I'm going to submit this many pull requests. These are things that I'm going to present at, you know, just to get a feel. These are conferences I'm going to submit talks to. And so my manager likes seeing stuff like this because then it gives him ways to show, like, well, what is she doing? And I want to tell more of the story about how effective is what I'm doing. And so I'll have a little section. I don't think I put it on this one because I'm a little behind this month, but I might say under highlights. I did it the first month. So I'll say something here about some highlights of some of the data points. To kind of make it a little more personal and give people stories to tell. Yeah, so there's a question, could you tell us a bit more on building a narrative? Sure, so what specifically, are you wondering, like what format or what specifically do you want to know more about building a narrative? I could talk a little bit about, so when I started, so at IBM, I think it was in relation with the personal mission statement. Okay, I'll flip over to, so here, in this page here, Eminence Activation Plan, so personal mission statement. So this is more, okay, so this is more about the, oh, I see. So about how it would overlap with the, yeah, I'm missing something. There's something, I think I put a note that I need to publish that up here. So that's what's missing from here. Oh, I wonder if I originally had it. Oh no, I have it under the activation plan. I was trying to decide if I wanted to do it separate. So under Eminence Activation Plan, this is where you're setting your goals and milestones. But this is where you'll have like your community engagement statement of purpose. And so building the narrative, it's really about imagine, and so this is what I imagine because this is what I was actually asked to do. As I was asked, so I attended Use R. It was the first R conference I'd been to. I'd used R on and off over the years, but I'd never really been super involved with the community. And then it was, since our group, data science is one of the areas that we're supposed to be engaging with, they were like, we need somebody to care about the R community. So I was like, okay, I'll be that person since I use it. And I ended up going to the Use R conference in Brussels, which was amazing and wonderful and fantastic. And I'd already been going to like some local R related meetup groups, and I had learned about R ladies and everything because I was using it and wanted to get better as an R user. And so what I ended up doing is sort of like a report. I wrote up a little community report. And so I was thinking about, okay, well, they want to know. So I'm trying to say strategically, like, what are some areas where the community needs help? What are some things that I think, you know, and so it's basic stuff like, how is the community organized? Oh, we also did, for IBM, we did these 201 talks for Open Source Week earlier this year, I think in February. And I ended up putting together a presentation about the R community, which also was really helpful in guiding this. So I need to get that pushed and published. Again, I can just do that with the knit button on RStudio. But, you know, so those questions that I highlight in the slides are generally things that guided my analysis when I was talking about the community. It's just, you know, just how are things organized? If you want to contribute to the community, what's the process for doing so? Do they have some kind of a new contributor group? Is there some kind of an official mentoring thing? And it's like, I think your first community, it's just know like they're all really different. And as you engage in different communities, like you're going to start seeing some common structures or common questions that you want to ask. But I think you can use like the stuff that I have in there as a guideline for writing that narrative. And so the big tip I would have is, so for example, so I found R Lady. So looking at the R community, it's kind of neat because there's a lot of different people from different fields in it. So if environmentalism and is something that's important to you, you can find opportunities in the R community, people who are ecologists or maybe not necessarily ecologists, but working in other fields that you can engage with. And you can maybe even create a special interest group if one doesn't exist already, where you can collaborate like with scientists and folks in other fields that are concerned about environmental effects. And you can write R packages or help support existing R packages towards that mission. So I guess that's like one example. If you really care about accessibility and you want to make sure that there are packages like ggplot and R has different color profiles. And so you want to make sure that they're usable. And so that can be your mission, that can be your thing. And then you also seek to educate people about accessibility, making sure people have access to the plots and the various visuals that you're creating. I could probably go on. So, kind of get creative about connecting dots and just see what other people in the community are doing. What are people writing books about, blogs about that you identify with? I hope that answers the question or helps you to answer the question. All right, well, it looks like there aren't any more questions. So I guess we can stop recording and probably end the session. Thanks.